place.
It's still in the right place. That's absolutely fine.
Okay.
Okay, we're going live now, but I'm going to introduce you, so don't worry.
Right.
Hello, everybody. I do apologise for the late start to this evening's webinar. We had a slight technical hitch. Unfortunately, Geraint was having trouble linking in on his phone. We were going to be doing it on his mobile phone, but we've resolved it by going back to his laptop. So I do apologise for any of you that have been waiting, but hopefully you can all see myself and Geraint. And first of all, I'd just like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Geraint. I know most of you will know Geraint, having come across him in some fashion, whether it's through his practice or whether it's through his involvement with sports and school vision. So we're delighted to have Geraint as our speaker this evening. Geraint is going to be talking about the understanding of binocular occupational vision, and in particular he's going to be talking about how important this is in relation to meeting the needs of your customers. Geraint is not going to be using any slides tonight. Geraint is a fantastic orator, so he's going to be doing it all verbally and hopefully and a little bit interactive. You'll be able to see his demonstrations, and I really do hope you enjoy the webinar. At the end, we'll have a period for questions and answers, and if you've used Zoom before, you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a Q&A icon. If you come up with a question during Geraint's talk, please enter it into the question answer at the time, just to ensure you don't forget the question, and then we'll pick those up at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you across to Geraint for this evening's webinar, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much, Geraint.
Thank you, John. Well, first of all, welcome to the real world. We're back at work now, thank goodness. Quite frankly, I don't know what the real world is anymore, whether it's post-COVID or pre-COVID. And it makes me think of some of the great people in our history, like Einstein, who worked out that time and space are an illusion, that in the singularity neither exists. We sit on day-to-day objects and we're told that there's nothing there but empty space. And now quantum mechanics are telling us strange things about the way electrons work and how they're not where they really are and so on. And in any case, we know, don't we, as optometrists and opticians, that what we see is an illusion. Stereopsis, for example, is just a construction of the combination of hand-eye coordination and the way that these images are represented in the cortex. And another thing, of course, we all forget is that everything we look at is upside down. And another interesting phenomenon, which I always find strange, is that everything we look at is double. Maybe not the direct image we're appearing at, but everything else beside that is double. And just before we go any further, I'd like you to satisfy yourself about that so you know where I'm coming from. So if you could find an object on a wall somewhere and look at it and hold your finger up about 12 inches from your face. And as you look at that object on the wall, you may be aware of seeing two fingers, one either side of the object. Well, that's what we see all the time. The brain just suppresses this image. And I think, and this is really what I want to get round to in this presentation, that none of us, optometrists, dispensing opticians included, have an understanding, an intuitive understanding of the separate function of each eye, because we're not able to intuitively understand that these artificial things, these non-realities like the double vision exist. We see a cyclopean view of the world, therefore we assume both eyes do the same thing. Now this is at the heart of, I think, what is the problem for us as a profession, and at the heart of what I believe is now becoming an existential dilemma. Which way do we go? And certainly pre-COVID, we were seeing the profession dividing into two parts. One which enjoys ophthalmology and seeks to manage that a little bit in practice, and the other side which is crudely called shopticians, and that's a derogatory title I don't really like, but there's a different commercial model there, which is less interested in the ophthalmology side of it, maybe, but more in the turnover to keep the practice going and the wages paid and so on. But in the process of this divide, both sides are beginning to convince themselves that the refraction, the nuts and bolts, the key core skills aren't really that necessary. The importance of refraction in particular has been forgotten, persuaded by the scientists who are beginning to tell us that you don't need to do a refraction now because we can give you an autorefractor and you can measure refraction in one eye and then the other and everything's all right. So we've convinced ourselves really technology is going to replace what we believe or have thought is a routine function. And as a result, the associated core skills like dispensing, occupational optics, and binocular vision have sort of fallen into the background. Now, does this matter? Well, I think it matters absolutely. We need to go back to where we are and where we exist on Earth and why we exist, why we survive. Now, after millions of years of evolution and adaptation to the difficulties we find ourselves in, we've begun to learn how to create our own reality out of the unreality of what is life on Earth and life in the universe and so on. We create our own reality. Now, fortunately, because in space, there's not even an up and down. You've got no idea where you are. But fortunately, due to a quirk of science, there's a warp in the space-time continuum where Earth exists. And due to that warp, we have a phenomenon called gravity. Now, that's our first saving grace, because here on Earth, we know what's up and we know what's down. We don't particularly worry that in Australia, it's the opposite. Australia, up is down and down is up. That doesn't concern us, not with dealing with the reality of where we are. So thanks to gravity, we have what I might call our y-axis, where we are in the vertical. Now, research in sport, in particular, has shown that there are two primary visual skills in all sports and other occupations. One is aiming, and the other is depth judgment. And these two skills predominate to various degrees in all occupations. Now, aiming is due to the dominant eye. And this is such an important skill or requirement that it is innate. We are born with a dominant eye. Now, the reason it's so important is because if we didn't have a dominant eye to tell us where we are in relation to the object we're looking at, we're not able to tell where other objects are in relation to us. Now, you need to think of the dominant eye as the rock on which all other sensory information is built. Now, I say all other sensory information because vision is by far the most important sense in us as hunter-gatherers. And 80%, some people argue, of what we know is directly or indirectly related to vision. So vision starts us off. Now, in terms of telling us where we are, this then, the dominant eye, the stable dominant eye, tells us where we are in relation to the object we're looking at. Now, that's our x-axis. That tells us where we are on that spectrum of the x-axis. Now, once the dominant eye is established, then the non-dominant eye comes in. Now, dominant eye doesn't look like that at an object. It looks directly at it, in line. That's the whole point of aiming in sport. It's in line. And the non-dominant eye comes from the side. Now, this is an important distinction because the dominant eye is fixed in space. It's rigid, it's a rock. The non-dominant eye is able to judge its position relative to that fixation. So it's able to fine-tune its position. And there's some interesting research about Maxwell's spots, which has actually shown that in normal binocular vision, the fovea, the anatomy of the fovea of the non-dominant eye is actually oval. which supports the idea that it is a searching part. So once you've established dominance, position, then the non-dominant eye comes in to adjust itself until it finds it's in the right position, so that the two foveas then have accurate positioning of that object. And then, by the distance between the foveas and the disparity from the center, we can judge distance. That finally gives us the z-axis. So eye dominance, x-axis, gravity, y-axis, non-dominant eye depth perception, gravity, y-axis, z-axis. Those are the three coordinates. And that's what gives us our ability to manage the world that we live in. Founded on eye dominance. So that's a little bit of an introduction to why vision is so important, not just seeing, but its relationship to all the other senses. Now, just while in passing, I'm already saying how important it is to understand eye dominance, and I believe that not many of us measure that in practice. So as an open-ended question, I'd like you to tell me how many of you already measure eye dominance in practice. I think John's going to take a register of that. So you just press yes or no, or don't know. I'll just see if that's responding.
I've just posted the poll, Geraint, so we'll give it another 10 seconds and I'll tell you the results.
Okay.
Okay, we've got 66% of our attendees this evening saying yes, 28% saying no, and we've got 6% saying don't know.
That's fantastic. I'm really pleased about that because you've already started in the right way. Now, what follows, I hope, will help to confirm why that's important and how your practice will benefit as a result of that. Now, so dominant eye, very important. Vision is the primary visual sense, 80%, as I said, of what we know is based on vision, directly or indirectly. So what happens if there's something wrong with the dominant eye? If this rock on which we build all sensory perceptions is some way unstable? Well, we see that all the time, and there's many, many people who have unstable eye dominance. And those amongst you who are listening, I think some of you, if not the majority, may from time to time have a difficulty telling left from right. Now, the only way we can tell left from right is if we have a feeling inside our brain that this is the dominant eye, therefore that's the right side. If for any reason the dominant eye is unstable and maybe the other eye takes over the job of aiming, then we don't know which is left and right. Because in life, on Earth, there's nothing there to reinforce that. I'm looking at you, this is my right hand, that's your left hand. If I turn around, it swaps. If I look in the mirror, it's the other way around. Nothing to reinforce that. And this is a blight for many people. Very simple illustration, but it's a blight. Very often it's associated with slightly poor hand-eye coordination. It makes it impossible to follow directions on a map like that. So sat-nav is a godsend to people who can't tell left from right. And it creates moments of stress when talking to other people. If you can't tell left from right, it makes you feel and seem stupid. Of course, it's not. It's nothing to do with that. But it has a profound effect on the way we carry out our life. So eye dominance, even in that simple illustration, is very, very important, and it goes on from there. So the effect of instability. Now, there is a tussle out there in the scientific establishment about the role of vision and conditions like dyslexia and dyspraxia. Now, if we look at dyslexia, for example, if you have an unstable dominant eye, and remember the role of the dominant eye is aiming. Now, if you're reading a line of letters and your dominant eye, tracking its way along those letters, suddenly fatigues and goes out, the minute it does that, the letter even swap to the other eye, the aiming process. And when that happens, of course, you lose your place. Now that to me is a description of what dyslexia is like. So I do say very strongly in practice, you have the predisposing signs to dyslexia. And since I've had an interest in this over the last 20 years or so, without exception, every single patient I've seen over that time with an official diagnosis of dyslexia has these binocular instabilities. Now, dyspraxia, same origins. If you're trying to navigate the world and your dominant eye, for example, let's say the right eye, is unstable, when it moves involuntarily because it's tired, the object you're looking at will move in the opposite direction. So you will tend to bump into it. You tend to find it difficult to judge the edge of a table when you put your foot down, when you put your cup down. And this, over time, if you add to the fact that it makes you hopeless at sport, lowers the self-esteem. Suddenly you become very often the academic type who doesn't like sport, and there's some stigma in some schools attached to that as well. In the end, you lose that bit of self-esteem. Now, I know most of you do actually measure eye dominance, but for those who don't, I'd just like to demonstrate the test for you. So what you do is ask your subject to put their right hand over their left and then peek through the gap you've made so that you can see which eye is peeping through the gap. Then you put the hands down again, and then you say swap them over and now peek through the gap again. And once more with the right hand again, and then the left hand. And I hope you can see that it's my left eye each time which is peeping through the gap. Now the reason we do it 4 times, and it's possible that some of you don't use that test, but the reason we do it 4 times in this particular method is it eliminates left-right bias. Because when you do this, there is a force by putting the right hand over the left to move your hands to the left and vice versa to the right. Now, if eye dominance is poorly established, then that force will actually swap eyes. And if that's enough to change the measurement of dominance, then there is a problem, full stop. The dominant eye is unstable. It's prone to losing its place. Now, what do we do when we measure unstable eye dominance? Well, we measure it using the fixation disparity test due to mallet. There are other ways of doing that. You can use the humble Brock string, which is just a bead on a string. So you hold the end of the string and the bead at about 40 centimeters. And when you look down the string, and looking at the bead, if you have physiological diplopia, as I demonstrated at the start, looking at the object and seeing 2 pens, then you know that there's no suppression. The bead itself becomes the nonius bars in the mallet unit, and the strings are the nonius bars, the bead becomes the fixation target. Now, if those strings appear to cross in front of the bead, it's an ESO fixation disparity. If it's passing after, it's an exo fixation disparity. Now, the point of that test is really to illustrate that this phenomenon is available in the real world in 3 dimensions. Sometimes it's quite difficult to understand then when you look at the flat screen mallet display. And in fact, for many reasons, the bead on the string is a more reliable test of a fixation disparity than the mallet unit, because people begin to know what's expected of them. Kids see the 2 bars in line maybe before you put the visor on, and they know what to say, they know what the answer to say is. But with a simple demonstration like the bead on the string, they see 1 string and they see 1 bead, and therefore, how on earth do I see 2 beads? It's a surprise, but it alerts them to that possibility. And it also alerts you to the possibility that there's a problem, some sort of suppression going on. And the same thing with the hand over hand eye test for dominance. It's not just simple, is it right or left? But you look at it and you look at the way the kid will do it. Some children will be staring hard at you like this, trying to figure out which is your left hand and which is your right hand, because they can't tell the difference. And doing this sort of thing. The hands won't go together. Others will go to the extreme of struggling like mad, and suddenly one hand covers their other eye. Now that's another important sign, because what they're saying to you when you see that sign is that I'm listening so hard, I'm trying to see so hard what you're demonstrating, and I can't tell left from right, so it's totally confusing to me. It's so hard that I've got nothing left to hear with. So I haven't heard the sense of your sentence, which is incomplete. Now I'd like you to put your right hand over your left. You don't say left hand, you leave it at left. Now someone who's understanding the logic, who's seeing what you're doing clearly, understands that. Those who don't assume that you mean over their left eye or whatever. So that's already a very difficult problem, indicating some binocular instability. And other things as well. If there's a drift like that, you've got good dominance, it's one eye, but it drifts in binocular conflict. So fixation disparity test, the official test of course is Mallet, is the way in which we measure the degree of displacement. Now it's very important to know that when you measure fixation disparity, that you're intending to correct it with prism. And we really have a big problem. Prism is almost a dirty word at the moment, which is understandable in terms of our appreciation of reality and how we navigate the world. And I'll just go back to that in a minute or two. But in the meantime, this is beginning to underlie why binocular refraction. Now, optometry is binocular. Dispensing optics is binocular. It's not one eye or the other. It's the way the two eyes work together. And in order to achieve comfortable binocular vision, when there's a fixation disparity, you have to put a prism in front of that eye, which bends light, so the two eyes can then work together comfortably. Now, the difference between the autorefractor and monocular correction of sight and binocular refraction is as different as chalk is to cheese. The autorefractor is a nice tool. I certainly wouldn't use it if my life depended on it. Now let's just go back to prism again, because I would almost say people are fearful of it. In Leicestershire, the NHS dispensing rate for prism is around 2%. And I suspect that's confounded by my own dispensing rate, which at the time was around 40%. It's now going up to around 70 or 80%. People fear prism. They fear prescribing it wrongly. They don't know how to prescribe it. And in business, when you give a prescription which doesn't work or people complain about, you have to pay for the recheck. So there's no business incentive to do that. And the problem is, with the way we were taught binocular vision, you can't understand it unless you understand eye dominance. That's the basis on which all vision is based, the rock on which vision is based. If you don't understand what that's for, you can't understand binocular vision. You can't understand, for example, why when you get a prism result, you don't split it. For instance, if the dominant eye is steady, has no deviation, but it's the non-dominant eye which is showing the slip. And remember, Mallet said, always put the prism in front of the eye with the slip. If you split that prism, what you do is change the direction of fixation of the dominant eye. You change its spatial awareness. So when you put a prism, base-in prism in front of the non-dominant eye, it'll move out. It changes its position and where you are in space. It's completely disorientating. On the other hand, if the dominant eye has the slip, in other words, it's drifting out uncontrollably, and you put the prism, base-in prism in front of that, the light will be bent in and the eye will not lose its position. It will maintain its position and its awareness of where it is. So if you split prism, you'll get rechecks and you'll probably do more harm than good. And also it's true, people talk about eating up prism and the rest of it. Mallet never said that. You correct what you find. It doesn't eat it up. And when you know that, you will then go on to find that too much prism is as bad as too little. And too in the wrong place is as bad as too little. Now, PRISM raises the vexed question of eye exercises and the role of accommodation. Now, eye exercises are very interesting because it is an alternative. I remember being told, think of eye exercises first because it doesn't cost anything. Eye care free at the point of delivery. Don't give them PRISM or correction, give them eye exercises. We did then go on to talk about the role of accommodation and how the refraction can affect the ocular muscle balance. And that was another inroad into that, which allowed us not to think about PRISM again. But exercises, now if you look at the literature, the one exercise which we all obsess about a little bit, because this is what you bring out in the PQE exams, is convergence insufficiency. And it's about the only exercise which seems to be, the only condition which seems to be easy to exercise, so typically pen to nose, isn't it? Now, the basic assumption is if you have a convergence insufficiency, you have weak medial recti. So what do? You give them a bit of exercise, make them grow a few biceps on their recti muscles. But that assumes that the recti is weak. What about if the lateral recti are slightly inelastic? And there's a good argument for that being the case, because we weren't born in an office reading a book. We were born on the savannah, looking at animals at the far distance with a view to running away or killing them for food. Now, for that purpose, we need a stable platform. And what better than two lateral recti, which keep the eyes focused in that position. As soon as you look up from where you are, they jump into place and you see accurately where the animal is. So there's an evolutionary reason why it might be the lateral recti that are causing the convergence problem. The other thing is that when people find convergence difficulty, they generally don't try to overcome that by thinking, I'll make my medial recti work harder. What they do is focus harder and use the accommodation vergence reflex. So you can, with enough effort and focusing hard enough, bring those eyes in. The problem with that is that when you give them eye exercises, you're not exercising the muscles, extraocular muscles at all. You're exercising the ciliary muscle. Now, in that situation, you've got a weak system, maybe potentially supporting another weak system. And what happens when muscles are continually under stress is that they begin to fatigue. And think of holding up a bucket of water for an hour or so. After 10 minutes, your arms will shake like that as the lactic acid builds up and the muscles go into spasm. And exactly the same thing happens in eyes. And that's exactly why eye exercises are difficult for me to justify, because if you're giving exercises like that, you're sending a patient out with unstable binocular vision. And what if the weak muscle is in the right eye, the medial rectus in the right eye? Why do you need to exercise the other eye? And what happens if you exercise them both together? Well, the chances are the right eye won't do anything. It'll leave the left eye to do everything. So then you're left with a skewed, unstable binocular vision system and no problem solved. Now, there are one or two papers on research of this. One particular one I found showed that there was only a 50% success rate judged by the difference between when the exercises were done and 12 weeks later. Now, in practice, if my success rate was 50%, I'd have gone out of business a long time ago. On top of that, 30% of the subjects got better through the placebo effect. So I'm thinking, what is the protocol? And worst of all, not damning, but it needs to be done, there was no follow-up beyond the 12 weeks. And we know exercises, any muscle exercise, if it's not continued, then the muscles will go back to where they were. So it's very difficult on that basis for me to judge that exercises are a good option. On top of which, many colleagues will be telling me they don't work, there's poor compliance, they come back in 6 months' time and nothing's changed. Now, our understanding of that, I think, has been led astray because of this word PRISM again, because of not understanding how the eyes work together. But we have developed an interest in the effect of accommodation on ametropia. And this is one of the guiding principles of a lot of research these days into the cause of myopia. Something to do with the over-accommodation causing a stretching effect. Now, that's led down a very difficult path with drugs like atropine. I think some Asian countries have put children through 2 years of high-dose atropine just to establish that they didn't become short-sighted, and they didn't. And now we followed that up a little bit in this country with low doses of atropine. So not only is it poison, let's try a low dose. But that's without understanding there's another problem with children have, and many adults, that they have poor accommodation. They're born with poor accommodation. Now, if you give a child, no matter how small a dose of atropine, this effect on accommodation will be just as difficult. And for the duration of this experiment, that experimental group will be forced to go to school not being able to see to read. Now, I find it very difficult to know how that research was clinically justified, how it got approval. And the problem with eye exercise in general, and this slightly skewed understanding of the role of accommodation without consideration of the extraocular muscles, all leads to people looking at symptoms. There's lots of symptoms, we know that, but not addressing the cause. So I go back to the basic understanding of eye dominance, where this cause comes from and what is the reason. And it may be as simple as a weak muscle in one eye. And then it's complicated sometimes by the adaptations to that. Research we did in a primary school in Heniock in Somerset, amongst primary school children, showed that of that group, 10% roughly had accommodation problems, 6% had a pure convergence difficulty, but by far the majority had an accommodation convergence in facilities, 70%. So in other words, you can't consider a binocular vision problem without taking both aspects into account, accommodation and convergence. Now, once you've done that, all sorts of interesting possibilities come up, which we're missing as a profession because we don't understand binocularity. For instance, myopia. Lots of good work done on the accommodation basis, not quite so sure about the atropine. But there's no definitive results coming out. It's all a little bit wishy-washy. Now, myopia, yes, I agree, this is an accommodation effect, but what we're forgetting to take into account is the effect on accommodation that a convergence insufficiency will have. So in other words, to stop myopia, you have to correct the accommodation problem, and ideally this is at near, if it's a near vision problem, but also compensate for the difficulty the extraocular muscles are having converging the fixation. You can't do one without the other. You can't do a little bit and give them a little bit of exercises to ginger up. You have to use the instruments, mallet, and a nice test for accommodation facility to correct them properly at that distance. And then, and this is probably one of the key findings of the research we're doing, you measure the results, not in 12 weeks' time or 2 years' time, but you measure the results directly on the impact of this information on their ability to track individual letters. So this is a big chart. The smaller one is 60 characters all in a line. Now, if the effect of this intervention, whether it reduces or stops myopia or not, or whether it produces binocular stability, the effect of this, by stabilizing the dominant eye, is that they then can track more quickly. Now, it's not good enough to use words or random words or paragraphs. It has to be individual characters because of the human visual system's ability to guess words and to extrapolate meaning. Individual characters. Now, if you do that all the time, if you measure the effect of your intervention, then you begin to appreciate how important the refraction is, the binocular balance, and how this might be influencing the cause of dyslexia or dyspraxia, and even going on, I could go on further, but ADHD, what is that? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. What is worse for attention is if you can't see what you're looking at, if the words are jumping around. That stops your attention. What is hyperactivity? It's a bright kid with this problem, sucking information from everywhere in his visual space, but he can't get it here, so he jumps from one place to another. And these kids, in the worst case scenario, are just given drugs to calm them down. And these are dreadful drugs. They're amphetamines, Ritalin, that sort of thing. Doctors don't know why they work, but when you understand that it's a muscle balance problem, what happens is that they work because they hyper the kid. It's like a shot of adrenaline, 10 cups of coffee. Suddenly the muscles are given a spurt of energy and they can control that convergence problem and they can see clearly. Despite being as high as a kite, they calm down. Now, the next most important factor, this is just skimming through the possibilities. I hope that I'm getting you interested with questions, and maybe this is the way for the future. Maybe this is the future of optometry. But let's make a leap now to the more broader consideration of the effect of vision on us as individuals. A little bit of anatomy here. The brain is 2% of body mass, but it uses 25% of the glucose we ingest. And most of what the brain does is vision. 80% directly or indirectly related to vision. So what happens if we have a visual problem? If there's a visual demand? Well, what happens is the demand for sugar goes up and up and up. Many people who have, perhaps unaware of this visual difficulty, will need sugar to keep them going. They fall asleep otherwise. What they're doing is feeding the brain's desire for sugar. And suddenly we can see a link. It's there, the logic is there for you to think about and explore. But why are so many people overweight? Why is there so much diabetes now in this IT world? Well, could it be something to do with the visual demand that modern technology puts on us? Something which we've never had to deal with in the whole of our evolution, overloading the visual system, diving into the sugar. And where does diabetes come from? It comes from insulin resistance. That's type 2 diabetes. That happens if you're overloading the body with sugar, continual need to absorb the sugar, then eventually the pancreas will say, right, had enough, I'm off. Now, the other problem is that when the sugar has been absorbed before type 2 diabetes occurs, of course, this sugar has to be absorbed and changed into fats in the liver, and that's where the overweight comes from. Now, I'm beginning to see this connection very clearly in practice, that those people overweight very often have a visual difficulty. Now, the story doesn't end there. This sugar source is very often from the cereals. These are the seeds of grasses, basically. We've never evolved to eat grass. And one of the reasons that our ancestors didn't is because grass and the seeds of grass contain proteins which are designed to stop insects eating these seeds. Now, these proteins, you may have heard of the word lectin, of which gluten is the most well-known example. These proteins, when they get into the gut, set it on fire, basically. They squeeze their way through the gut intestinal wall lining, and then the body reacts, it would, to any invading pathogen by stimulating the nervous system, stimulating the immune system to eat them up. But they're clever little things, these bits of protein, because the surface of them, the thing which the body recognizes, mimics some of our own tissue. So not only are we invaded by a foreign body, but we're also fooled into attacking ourselves, our own tissue, our bloodstream, lungs, joints, and the rest of it. Setting up what everybody has known now as an autoimmune response, the body attacking itself. It's much more complicated than that. The body is fooled into attacking itself because of all this sugar from these particular plants. And the food manufacturers are very happy to supply us with this particular food because it's filling, lots of sugar, it's cheap to produce, and they put it in everything. There are some places where you can't get a meal without these dietary additions. Now that's just touching on another huge area of understanding which comes in with the remit of optometry. So what does this mean in terms of our future? Well, I use the word gently, commercial opportunity. More than that, it's a huge clinical duty and opportunity, whatever you like to call it. I know my own experience, and I've been doing this for 12 years now, because I wanted to show that what we were doing and the research we were having made sense. Our own practice, our little practice in Anstey, has gone from a £67,000 a year turnover to 250,000, so it's a threefold increase and above. Most of our patients are private, and because we can justify what we do in terms of their general health and their future and how this relates to their vision. Every patient we see has multiple dispensings because we can argue the case for a pair for reading or a varifocal for general use, and then there might be one for distance for the sun and so on, all argued from first principles based on, at the heart of it, the dominant eye. Everything follows from that. And people, because you can explain what you're doing, because you understand what you're doing, people are prepared to pay for that service. Not grudgingly, but thankfully. So where is the future? The broad conclusion is, in this tiny little space I've had here, is that we should be measuring binocular function, not monocular. This simple understanding changes everything. And it's never been more important now than it is, because we've got two blocks of the profession diverging, and neither of them are attending to this, what we are actually there to do, what is our unique role. No one else can do this, to look after people's health and sight. And it elevates vision from an inconvenience of it's a bit blurred to something which explains our existence and how to prevent, allow us to prevent, not cure, that's someone else's job, prevent ocular, systemic, and psychological morbidity. Now, this cannot be automated. And through the supply of spectacles and contact lenses gives us a great commercial opportunity and power to do good. Right, my time has just about run out, and I hope you got some questions. So if you'd like to have more information, then go to svuk.info or let SightCare know. And I think John may have some questions lined up now for me to answer. So I'm happy to hand back over to you, John, to see if anybody wants to know anything more.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Geraint. That was absolutely excellent. Yes, we've got a couple of questions at the moment. While I'm asking Geraint these questions, please do type into the Q&A icon on your screen, and I'm sure Geraint will welcome any question from any aspect, any angle, because I know Geraint wants to make this a real debate about this subject matter. The first one, Geraint, is from Parminda Chana, and she's asking, can eye dominance change if non-dominant is kept for some time with better VA?
Yeah, there is evidence from sport that you can develop what's called, I would call, a super eye dominant situation. It's an adaptation. But eye dominance itself is innate. In other words, if you're in a sport where left eye dominance is particularly important, you can, with enough perseverance and practice, begin to understand that other eye as the lead eye. But it's never as good as the real thing. And the first thing you avoid in all instances in sport and all other occupations is to try and change that dominance. It's the way to chaos for the individual because it's so unreliable. But yes, there is evidence that some people, if they want to do it bad enough, can develop a superimposed dominance.
Thank you. Rosemary McWaters is asking, children being homeschooled, is this likely to create any specific binocular vision issues as they have not been looking up to see the board? I would have suggested jump convergent exercises. What would you suggest?
Yeah, well, the first part, not looking up the board, in theory, that's going to be a bigger problem, because sustained convergence at a near point is what sets the system up to strain. Very difficult, very fatiguing. Now, you get some relief when you look up to the board, because that's resting the accommodation and the convergence. But then you're back to looking at it again. So yes, that is an argument why homeschooling is not necessarily the best thing. It's too concentrated on the near point. Fortunately, I think most parents, I shouldn't say this because my kid is not at home now, but a lot of parents find that it's so totally boring doing these lessons all day. They let the kids run around outside, and that's better than anything, because then you are focusing in the distance and all the strain goes away. And there's certainly underlying problems with binocularity. Now, jump convergence, interesting. Eye exercise. You've got the gist of what I think about eye exercises. I think they're treating a symptom, not a sign. What I'd much prefer to do is work out the binocular issues at near, and then see if they're different in the distance. And then I could then prescribe either near vision spectacles exclusively, or a bifocal or a varifocal lens with an addition at the near, or maybe a prism which is appropriate for distance and near. Where it gets difficult is if the prismatic correction is different at near than it is in the distance. And then you have to go to more detailed solutions. But jump convergence, I'm afraid, it falls into the category of eye exercises for me, and I can't look at someone and justify that for all the reasons that I've explained. Did that answer the question, John?
Thank you, Geraint. Sorry, yes, that was excellent. Moaz Najwani is asking. He's saying, so we were trained in all this orthoptics. So how did we lose it? One reason was the NHS was questioning it. Why, as a profession, have we not stood up for this? Do you think?
Well, it all goes back to the day when we got our contract, isn't it? It's the political mood at the time was to bring free eye tests to everybody. And one of the conditions for us was to be able to recognize pathology. And we have been in awe, and justifiably, I have great admiration for our medical colleagues, but we defer to them. Now, at a similar time, we were developing an embryological view of orthoptics. Our colleagues in London, famously Mr. Mallet, and we approached the hospital eye service and said, would you like us to develop this orthoptic idea? And the hospital eye service said, no, we can't afford you. But they recognized the importance of relating binocular vision to the need for indicating pathology and so on. So this skill was taken on by the hospitals, and they developed a new profession called orthoptists. Now, at the time of the transfer, of course, they didn't take refraction with them. They did take our early stumbling findings about eye exercises. They didn't take on board that other stream of thought, which was fixation disparity and the correction of prism. So in other words, because we don't understand it, we look to someone who maybe partially understands it, and because they belong to the medical profession, we defer to them for advice. And with great respect to my orthoptic colleagues who don't refract, who don't supply specs and contact lenses, and who aren't privy to the research we've done and the importance of eye dominance, they can't have the same understanding of the physiological effects of muscle imbalance. Their understanding is much more to do with the pathological effects. Now, the problem is, of course, we have been taught very often by orthoptists, because there's no one else out there who understands binocular vision. They understand it as far as they need to within the hospital eye service, but not in terms of what we need in practice, the physiology of binocular vision in people who have actually nothing wrong with their eyes.
Thank you, Geraint. Moaz actually has a second question.
Yep.
Moaz, I'm going to allow you to talk. Let's have a bit of interaction here. So Moaz, if you'd like to ask your question, you're now able to talk.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I
Yes,
can, Moaz, yeah.
Okay, so first, Geraint, I totally agree with what your sentiments are at the moment. And as you said, when we were trained by Mallet and all that, we did all of these tests and correcting prisms until the NHS picked us up saying, why are you giving prisms and you are overprescribing and all that, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep.
we as a profession kind of lost out on it, right?
Yep.
Now, in a way, and the other thing I was saying now that since we used to do it in the past because we had the dispense from the patient, right? Once we lost the dispense and the income, obviously these exams then had to be speeded up because then you couldn't spend a lot of time on this child to do all of that extra work at no extra payment. So to me, that's where the bugbear is as a profession, we need to tell our AOPs and the college that at the end of the day, you're selling my profession out because we're not doing what we're trained for and you're not standing up for us.
Yes, I agree. And the difficulty is, as you say, the institutions are against us.
Yeah.
Wherever you look, there's this, people raise their eyebrows when you mention PRISM.
Yeah.
As though it's some sort of black magic. It's nothing at all. I agree absolutely with what you say, Moaz.
Thank you, Moaz. Thank you, Moaz. I'd like to invite Mohammed Kazmani, who I know is on the webinar this evening. Mohammed, I know, is a practitioner in school vision.
Yes.
Moaz, if you'd like to unmute yourself, would you like to maybe explain to everybody this evening how you're finding the provision of school vision within your practice, and perhaps how you're marketing it in a manner which is enabling your community to be aware of this this unique and differentiated eye care service? Can you speak, Mohammed?
Yes, I'm there. Sorry, I was in the other room. My daughter was watching.
Don't worry. Sorry for putting that upon you.
Right. Well, I mean, school vision itself, the most important thing I found was building your connections with Senkos. I was fortunate that I developed a good relationship with one, and she has managed to, refer patients to me. She actually took on the understanding of what we do with school vision, and how vision plays its part in helping patients with dyslexia. Again, the other side is making sure that you're getting the message out there. I mean, Geraint's got some brilliant bits of POS that we can utilize. And whoever you're going to be communicating with, it's important to let them understand what school vision's about. He's got all of that on his webpage as well. And in terms of patient experience, those who've undergone the school vision assessment and have had their spectacles prescribed, etc., they can, their parents can see the difference it's making to them. Until then, a lot of them were just struggling. So
lovely. Thank you very much, Mohammed. That's very valuable. No other questions on the Q&A at the moment, but if I may ask, Geraint, from your point of view, what do you see as being the key communication or the key messages that need to be put out to the patients that are coming into the independent practice at the moment, who perhaps are not aware of what is happening in relation to their child's vision, and how they might be able to detect anything before they actually bring the child to the optometrist? Is there anything that, from your long experience, has enabled you to try and educate the parents to be conscious of looking out for any problems with their child's vision, and particularly through their school work?
Well, a lot of the parents who come to us already know this. They've been going for years to some of our colleagues and being told there's nothing wrong with their sight. They're very aware that their child is not behaving as they would expect them to behave. Very often they don't appreciate that this could be visually related. And what I'm in the great position now of not having to go out and educate anybody. They come to me, not just from Leicester, but from the whole of the country and all over the world. So the most important thing is for us as colleagues to actually understand why we do this, and to do the refraction in a way, and the whole consultation in a way that relates binocular vision and health and all these other issues, which I believe will all come together in time, myopia, lots of people concerned about that, diabetes and so on. With every single patient who comes in, as you begin to gain expertise in this field, it'll generate more people to come. Now, having said that, if you want to take that extra step, some colleagues do prepare a questionnaire. They might circulate this amongst the local population, suggesting that if any of these signs are apparent in their children, that it might be worth coming in to have a full binocular vision assessment, full eye test. So that's another route down that. But the word of mouth is the most powerful way in which this message is spread. I can only give you examples of colleagues in New Zealand who come over to learn how to do this. Their practice now is the biggest in New Zealand. They don't advertise, they come to them, and he is particularly revered by his colleagues in New Zealand. So yes, do what you can, but the great distinction between us and maybe other colleagues who aren't quite as confident with their routine as we are, is that generally speaking, we don't need to spend a lot on marketing. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but other colleagues spend an awful lot on marketing because maybe there are people who are not happy with the result of their test. Maybe they tell other people that. I don't know how it works. But unless you're continually marketing and advertising, you don't make up the loss. Possibly that's the risk if you're not doing the job properly. And people pick onto that quickly. So first and foremost, do the job properly. Understand the principles that we've talked about today. Get a diploma in the subject, for heaven's sake. I'm not standing here saying, find out yourself. We can tell you how to do it properly and formally, and then maintain your progress and your learning period over time. But so I think that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Parminda is asking again, do you use colour overlays or tints?
No, but part of what we do understands the reason why they are used. It's quite a long story. It was developed first by Helen Erlen. She's not an optometrist, not a dispensing optician. I think she's a psychologist. But she found out that when she put a coloured overlay over black print, some of her children read faster. Now this can be understood very simply from the effects, the physical effects of a filter on top of a white page of print. For example, if you use a green filter, it absorbs some of the light being reflected off the page, which is very distracting to a child with high light sensitivity. So a green filter works to take out the blue and the UV and make it more relaxing. In other children, a yellow filter works because yellow gives better contrast. Now this is a separate group of children who are suffering a degree of amblyopia, poor visual development. So they love that yellow color and the harsh contrast between yellow and black. Different causes, different types of overlays needed. Now, what we know from research is this degree of light sensitivity and the incidence of amblyopia is related to the degree of the binocular vision problem. So what we do is measure light sensitivity and color preference in a separate test and include whatever tint is required in the spectacles. Now, the obvious advantage of that is that you remove the barrier to the printed page, so you can actually write on it if you want to. This colored overlay is a big barrier and an inconvenience. So yes, very much take that into account. The importance of color is tremendous, and I could talk about the colorimeter as well and where that fits into the picture. But all of this is part of the sphere of school vision and advanced binocular vision.
Thank you. Just conscious of the time, we're over our hour. One last question from Alan McDonald. Alan, if you can still hear me and you're still online, I'm allowing you to talk. Would you like to put your question to Garrett?
Not sure you'll hear me because my microphone's not working very well.
No, you're
Great,
absolutely
Alan.
fine. We can hear you loud and clear, Alan.
Yeah.
Thanks. I just wondered, if we read from left to right, does it affect reading depending which eye is dominant? Do we read better if we're right eye dominant compared to that?
It has an effect, and you'll notice this occasionally when someone reads the Snellen chart, they read it from the wrong side. Now, if their eye is drifting off in that direction, then it's much easier to start with the, what would be the left-hand side, because that's where the gaze is led, and go that way. Now, we can't do that in English because we have to read from the left. But when there's a choice, some people read from the right, if it's just reading out letters. Now, so the implication of your question is, does that make it more difficult for some of us in English to read because of that binocular difficulty? Can you just add to that with your question?
Yeah, all I was going to say, Geraint, is there's a lot of people, when you do ask them, as you say, to read the test chart, always read it back to front.
Yeah.
Should we then be thinking there's an instability there just because of that?
Absolutely. Diagnostic. Yes. From that moment on, you're looking for this problem.
Okay. Yeah.
Very simple.
The other thing, if I can jump in for 2 seconds, is when I do sport vision stuff, Geraint, I always do dominant eye tests the way you show us.
Well done.
But is that still the best way to do kids? Is that still the best way to tell their dominance?
It is. I haven't found anything better. Well, some of our colleagues, as you know, have done research in this, and it always comes back to this simple test because it eliminates left eye dominance. Now, in the very young kids, I think this is what you're alluding to. You can't get them to do this, but you'd be surprised how young they can do when they do this. 3-year-olds can just about manage it. So I would try that first. And of course, the other thing is, at that age, you're not necessarily hugely concerned about tracking because I haven't got into little letters yet. At that age, what you're more concerned about is the family history and any obvious signs of binocular difficulty, obvious squints, so ESO, overconvergence, that sort of thing. So we don't need to get too concerned about these finer tests at such a young age, but we do need to be bearing in mind all the time where these binocular vision problems come from. That's history and over-accommodating. Quick look with the retas, this is a big plus patient here, and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Perinda, Perinda's just asking if the webinar has been recorded, and yes, it is, and it should be on the SightCare website, and I'm sure Geraint will want to put it on the Sports Vision, the School Vision website as well. We're at 6:10, and I'm sure we could go on with many, many more questions, but what I'd like to do now is I'm just going to put a poll up, which is just giving everybody an opportunity. If you would like to get some more information about School Vision, if you can just answer the poll that's coming up on your screen, that would enable us to know who you are, and I would forward that to Geraint, and Geraint would be more than willing to get in touch and perhaps give you some more information or discuss any other particular questions you might have. So that poll is just up at the moment. If you can just answer that. While everybody's doing that, I'll just take this opportunity to thank Geraint for an excellent webinar, and how refreshing it is to see somebody give an hour-long talk without using any slides. It's so much more engaging. Right, I'm just going to end the poll and share the results. And yes, 77% of our delegates who are still with us, Geraint, have said yes to wanting further information. So I'll share that information with you, and perhaps you can engage with these practitioners about that.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and perhaps you're referring to your colleague in New Zealand. Perhaps we could maybe invite him to come and do a webinar for SightCare in the future, where he might want to talk about his particular experiences with this specialism, if that's something you might want to consider.
He'd love to do that. I'll send him an email tonight.
Yes, absolutely. What I plan to do, Geraint and I have discussed that maybe over coming months, we might look to do some follow-up webinars, perhaps focusing a bit more on the sports vision, perhaps, and giving everybody an opportunity to learn from Geraint as an expert, and also to be able to answer any specific questions they may have. Well, it just brings me to thank Geraint once again for a superb webinar. It is recorded, so if you do want to watch it again, just log on to the SiteCare website or the SV UK website. If I can just let you know about our next webinar, which will be taking place on Tuesday, the 30th of June. So that's next Tuesday at 12 p.m. So it's during the day. Hopefully, you may well be able to attend. Obviously, if it's lunchtime, if you're open, if you're not open yet, then you can join us. That webinar is going to be called Returning to Work, and it's going to be all about what does this mean for your practice. We have an expert health and safety manager going to be talking about the current situation of COVID-19 and what this means for your practice, and he'll be discussing the need for practices to be COVID secure, which I know you're all thinking about and probably sleeping and dreaming about at the moment. He'll be talking about risk assessment, implementing social distancing, robust cleaning, disinfecting regimes, and good personal hygiene. So if you do want to register for that, look out for the communications which will be coming out shortly. So thank you all very much for joining tonight's webinar. Thank you, Geraint, once again. And I'll wish you all a very good evening and look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. Good night.
Bye-bye.